Welcome, dear listener, to a gentle journey through time, a quiet exploration of an age long past, where crowns were heavy not just with gold, but with burdens we can barely imagine today. As you settle into your comfortable space, let your breathing slow and deepen. Allow yourself to drift back with me to a world of stone castles and flickering candlelight, where being a king was perhaps the most dangerous job in all the realm. Take a moment to imagine the weight of a medieval crown upon your head, not just the physical weight of metal and precious stones, but the crushing weight of responsibility, of constant danger, of a life lived always on the edge of disaster. Tonight, we'll explore together why the Golden Throne was often more curse than blessing, why the royal bed was rarely a place of peaceful rest, and why medieval kings often longed for the simple life of their subjects. Let your mind wander now, back through the centuries, past the age of steam and industry, past the Renaissance with its art and learning, back to the dim corridors of medieval castles where kings walked in shadows, their footsteps echoing on cold stone floors. The air is thick with the scent of burning rushes and the ever-present dampness of stone walls. Can you smell it? The mixture of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of fear that seemed to permeate every royal residence. Picture yourself now in the year 1300. The world is vast and largely unknown, filled with dangers both real and imagined. Communication travels at the speed of a horse, and a king's realm might stretch for hundreds of miles, each corner potentially harboring rebellion, invasion, or plague. The weight of the crown grows heavier with each passing moment as we begin to understand the true burden of medieval kingship. Gently, let us begin our exploration of why being a medieval king was, quite literally, one of the worst jobs in human history. The morning sun barely penetrates the narrow windows of the royal chamber as our imaginary medieval king awakens. Not to luxury and comfort, but to the harsh realities of survival in an age where death lurked around every corner. The stone walls weep with condensation, and despite the large fireplace, the room remains perpetually cold and damp. Our king's breath forms small clouds in the frigid air as he contemplates another day of navigating the treacherous waters of medieval politics. Imagine the king's first concern upon waking, not what to wear or what to eat, but whether he would live to see another sunset. Medieval kingship was, statistically speaking, one of the most dangerous occupations in history. A study of European monarchs from 1000 to 1500 reveals that kings were more likely to die violent deaths than common soldiers. The crown, rather than protecting its wearer, seemed to attract violence like a lightning rod attracts storms. Let your mind drift to the court of a typical medieval king. Picture the great hall, with its soaring stone arches and massive wooden beams, darkened by centuries of smoke from countless fires. The morning light filters through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the rushes scattered on the floor. The rushes, meant to absorb spills and provide some insulation against the cold stone, are rarely changed and harbor fleas, lice, and the accumulated filth of court life. The sweet smell of rotting vegetation mingles with the less pleasant odors of human habitation in an age before regular bathing. Our king must navigate this environment while maintaining the appearance of divine authority. But underneath the royal robes, his body bears the constant stress of his position. Medieval kings aged rapidly, their faces lined with worry, their backs bent from carrying the weight of their responsibilities. Contemporary accounts describe kings with premature grey hair, nervous tics, and the haunted look of men who knew their enemies were always watching, always waiting for a moment of weakness. The royal breakfast, rather than being a luxurious affair, was often a hurried and anxious meal. Food tasters stood ready to sample each dish, their lives dependent on their ability to detect poison. Imagine the king watching their faces carefully, looking for any sign of distress, any indication that today might be his last. The bread, often made from grain that had been stored in damp conditions, might harbor dangerous molds. The meat, preserved with salt and spices to mask the taste of decay, carried the constant risk of food poisoning. Even the wine, the king's only escape from the harsh realities of his position, might conceal deadly toxins placed there by ambitious nobles or foreign agents. Let us pause here for a moment. Breathe deeply and slowly. Allow yourself to feel the weight of this constant vigilance, this never-ending fear that permeated every aspect of a medieval king's existence. The very act of eating, one of life's most basic pleasures, became a dance with death. The political landscape of medieval Europe was a labyrinth of shifting alliances, ancient grudges, and barely contained violence. A king's authority extended only as far as his ability to project power, and that power was constantly challenged by ambitious nobles, foreign invaders, and even members of his own family. The feudal system, while providing a theoretical framework for governance, was in practice a barely controlled chaos of competing interests and divided loyalties. Picture our king receiving his morning reports from his advisors and spies. Each piece of news brings fresh concerns. A baron in the north has been seen gathering men-at-arms. Is he planning rebellion or merely preparing for a hunting expedition? A neighboring king has requested a meeting. Is this an opportunity for alliance or a trap? Ships have been spotted off the coast. Are they merchants or the advance guard of an invasion fleet? The king's council chamber, lit by flickering candles and the occasional ray of sunlight through narrow windows, echoes with whispered conversations and the scratch of quills on parchment. Maps, crude by our standards but precious beyond measure in their time, are spread across heavy wooden tables. These maps, filled with blank spaces marked "Here be dragons" or simply left empty, represent the vast unknown that surrounded every medieval kingdom. A king's enemies might be gathering just beyond the edge of the known world, and he would have no warning until their armies appeared on his doorstep. Imagine the stress of making decisions with incomplete information, of sending armies to fight battles based on rumors and speculation. A medieval king had no satellites, no radio communications, no way of knowing what was happening beyond the range of a fast horse. Messages took days or weeks to arrive, and by the time a king received word of a crisis, it might already be too late to respond effectively. The weight of these decisions pressed down upon the crown like a physical burden, bowing the king's shoulders and etching deep lines of worry into his face. The royal court, far from being a place of luxury and refinement, was a nest of vipers where every smile might hide a dagger and every compliment might conceal a threat. Courtiers jockeyed for position and favor, forming alliances and conspiracies that shifted like shadows on a wall. A king could never be certain who among his advisors could be trusted, who might be feeding information to his enemies, or who might be planning to place a different claimant on the throne. Let your imagination wander through the drafty corridors of the royal palace. Stone walls echo with the whispers of conspirators, and every corner might hide an assassin. The king's personal guard, theoretically loyal unto death, were often recruited from the ranks of ambitious young nobles who saw service to the crown as a stepping stone to greater power. How could a king sleep peacefully, knowing that the men sworn to protect him might be the very ones planning his downfall? The medieval king's day was filled with an endless procession of petitions, disputes, and administrative duties that would challenge even a modern bureaucrat. Imagine sitting in judgment over cases ranging from disputes between neighboring farmers to accusations of treason against powerful nobles. Each decision carried the potential for creating new enemies or alienating crucial allies. A king who was too lenient was seen as weak and invited rebellion. One who was too harsh was branded a tyrant and faced the constant threat of assassination. The royal throne, carved from stone or heavy wood and adorned with whatever precious materials the kingdom could afford, was less a seat of comfort than an instrument of endurance. Kings sat for hours at a time, their backs aching, their legs numb, listening to an endless parade of complaints, requests, and reports. The crown itself, depending on its design, might weigh 10 pounds or more, causing headaches and neck strain that became constant companions of royal life. Consider the loneliness of medieval kingship. A king could never truly relax, never let down his guard, never speak freely without considering the political implications of his words. Even his closest family members might be plotting against him. History is full of sons who murdered their fathers for the crown, brothers who waged war against brothers, and wives who conspired with foreign enemies. The royal bedchamber, rather than being a sanctuary, was often the most dangerous place in the castle, where poison, smothering, or a blade between the ribs might end a reign in the dark hours before dawn. Breathe slowly and deeply as we explore this isolation. Imagine the weight of knowing that you can trust no one completely, that every relationship is colored by political calculation, that even your children might see you as an obstacle to their own ambitions. The medieval king lived in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury, but starved of genuine human connection. The medieval world was a place of almost unimaginable violence, where warfare was not an occasional interruption to peaceful life, but a constant reality. A king's reign was measured not just in years, but in battles fought, cities besieged, and enemies defeated or fled from. The romantic image of knightly combat, popularized by later literature, bears little resemblance to the brutal reality of medieval warfare. Picture our king preparing for battle. The process begins hours before dawn, with servants helping him into his armor, layer upon layer of metal and padding designed to turn aside sword blows and arrow points, also trap heat and restrict movement. The full suit of armor worn by a medieval king might weigh 60 pounds or more, distributed across his entire body, but still exhausting to wear for extended periods. The helmet, necessary to protect the head and face, severely limited vision and hearing, making the battlefield a confusing maze of partial glimpses and muffled sounds. The king's war horse, bred for size and aggression, was itself a weapon weighing more than a ton, and trained to strike out with iron-shod hooves and bite with powerful jaws. But the horse was also a liability. If it fell or was killed, the king would find himself trapped beneath its weight, helpless before enemy weapons. Many medieval kings died not from direct combat, but from being crushed beneath their fallen mounts or trampled by charging cavalry. Let your mind wander across a medieval battlefield. The ground is churned to mud by thousands of feet and hooves, mixed with blood and worse things. The air is thick with dust and smoke, filled with the screams of wounded men and horses. Arrows fall like deadly rain, and the clash of metal on metal creates a constant, deafening din. In this chaos, the king must not only fight for his own life, but provide leadership and inspiration to his troops, all while maintaining the composure expected of divine royalty. The aftermath of battle brought its own horrors. Medieval medicine was primitive, and wounds that would be easily treatable today often meant slow, agonizing death from infection or blood loss. Kings who survived battles often carried permanent injuries that caused lifelong pain and disability. Richard the Lionheart, one of the most famous warrior kings of the medieval period, spent his final years suffering from an infected crossbow wound that eventually killed him. The very activities that brought a king glory and expanded his realm also broke down his body and shortened his life. Even when not actively at war, the medieval king lived under the constant threat of invasion. Enemy armies could appear with little warning, and the king's response had to be swift and decisive. This meant maintaining expensive standing armies or the ability to quickly raise levies from the nobility and common people. The cost of constant military readiness was enormous, and the taxation required to support it often led to domestic unrest and rebellion. Imagine the sleepless nights spent in the royal chamber, listening for the sound of warning horns that might signal approaching enemies. The king's rest was always fitful, interrupted by dreams of defeat and death, by the need to rise and respond to midnight alarms that might prove false or might herald the beginning of the end of his reign. The royal bed, rather than being a place of comfort and restoration, became another battlefield where the king fought against exhaustion and despair. The medieval castle, that symbol of royal power and security, was in reality a prison as much as a fortress. The thick stone walls that kept enemies out also trapped the king inside, surrounded by air that was perpetually stale and heavy with smoke from torches and fireplaces. The narrow windows, designed to prevent enemy archers from finding easy targets, also prevented adequate light and ventilation from entering the royal apartments. Picture the daily routine within these walls. The king's movements were restricted by the need for security, by the weight of ceremony, and by the simple physical limitations of medieval architecture. Stone stairs, worn smooth by centuries of use, were treacherous in the dim light of torches. Doorways were narrow and low, requiring even average-sized people to duck and turn sideways. The great halls, impressive in their scale, were impossible to heat effectively, leaving their occupants shivering in the vast spaces beneath soaring stone vaults. The royal apartments, theoretically the most luxurious spaces in the castle, were still primitive by any modern standard. Floors were covered with rushes that absorbed spills and provided some insulation, but also harbored fleas, lice, and the accumulated filth of daily life. Tapestries hung on the walls provided some warmth and color, but they also trapped smoke and odors, becoming repositories for the less pleasant aspects of medieval life. Privacy, something we take for granted today, was almost unknown to medieval royalty. The king was constantly surrounded by servants, guards, advisors, and petitioners. Every meal was a public performance, every conversation potentially overheard by interested parties. Even the most intimate aspects of royal life, including the king's health and the state of his marriage, were subjects of court gossip and political speculation. Let yourself imagine the exhaustion of never being alone, of having every word weighed and measured, every expression analyzed for signs of weakness or opportunity. The medieval king lived his entire life on stage, performing the role of divinely appointed ruler, even when his body was racked with pain, his mind clouded with worry, and his spirit crushed by the weight of impossible responsibilities. The royal diet, despite the abundance of food available to the crown, was both monotonous and dangerous. Meat, when available, was heavily salted or smoked to preserve it, loading the king's system with sodium and increasing the risk of high blood pressure and heart disease. Fresh vegetables were rare, especially in winter, leading to scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies. The bread, made from coarse grain, was often contaminated with ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Medieval kings were particularly susceptible to food poisoning and gastrointestinal diseases, both because of the poor quality of preserved foods and because of deliberate poisoning attempts by enemies. The royal stomach became a battlefield where spoiled meat and toxic substances fought for the king's life. Contemporary accounts describe kings suffering from chronic digestive problems, painful stomach ailments, and mysterious illnesses that may have been the result of slow poisoning campaigns carried out over months or years. The spices that flavored royal meals, imported at great expense from distant lands, were often used to mask the taste of spoiled food rather than to enhance fresh ingredients. These spices, carried by caravans across thousands of miles of dangerous territory, might be contaminated with sand, insects, or deliberate adulterants added by unscrupulous merchants. The very luxury that marked the king's table became another source of potential danger and discomfort. Water, the most basic necessity of life, was often more dangerous than wine for medieval royalty. Castle wells might be contaminated by seepage from latrines or by the deliberate introduction of poison or diseased animal carcasses by enemies during sieges. Rivers and streams carried the runoff from upstream settlements, including human waste and the byproducts of various crafts and industries. Kings often preferred wine or ale, not for the intoxicating effects, but because the alcohol killed many of the dangerous microorganisms that thrived in medieval water supplies. Take a moment to breathe deeply, to appreciate the simple safety of the water you drink, the food you eat, the air you breathe. These basic elements of survival, which we rarely think about today, were constant sources of anxiety and danger for medieval kings. The question of royal succession haunted every medieval king from the moment he took the throne until the day he died. The lack of a clear, universally accepted system for determining the next ruler meant that every death of a king potentially triggered a civil war. Kings without male heirs faced the prospect of their kingdoms being torn apart by competing claimants after their deaths. Kings with multiple sons often watched their children turn against each other in their eagerness to secure the throne. Imagine the heartbreak of a medieval king watching his sons, whom he loved as any father loves his children, plotting against each other and against him. The bonds of family, which should have provided comfort and support, instead became sources of suspicion and fear. A king's brother might be his closest ally or his most dangerous enemy. His wife might be his partner in ruling, or a foreign agent working to advance the interests of her birth family over those of her adopted kingdom. The medieval king's relationship with his queen was as much a political alliance as a marriage, arranged to secure treaties, cement alliances, or bring valuable resources to the kingdom. Love, if it developed at all, was a bonus rather than an expectation. Many royal marriages were marked by mutual suspicion, competing loyalties, and the constant pressure to produce male heirs to secure the succession. The royal nursery was not a place of joy and childhood innocence, but another arena of political maneuvering. Royal children were valuable pawns in the game of international politics, their marriages arranged while they were still infants to secure alliances that might not materialize for decades. The education of royal children focused not on personal fulfillment, but on the skills needed to survive and thrive in the brutal world of medieval politics. Young princes learned swordplay not as a sport, but as a life or death skill they would need on the battlefield. They studied languages not for the joy of literature, but to communicate with foreign allies and enemies. They memorized genealogies and territorial claims, not out of historical interest, but because these details might someday justify a war or support a treaty negotiation. Childhood for royal children was a brief prelude to a lifetime of danger and responsibility. The medieval king's relationship with the church was another source of constant tension and difficulty. Kings ruled by divine right, their authority supposedly granted by God himself, but they were also subject to the spiritual authority of the Pope and the local clergy. This dual loyalty created endless opportunities for conflict, as kings and religious leaders struggled for supremacy in matters both spiritual and temporal. Picture our king kneeling in the cold stone chapel of his castle, surrounded by the flickering light of hundreds of candles. The air is thick with incense, a mixture of frankincense and myrrh that was supposed to carry prayers heavenward, but also masked the less pleasant odors of unwashed bodies and dampness. The king's knees ache against the hard stone floor as he prays for guidance, for protection, for the strength to carry on for another day. But even in prayer, the king cannot escape the political calculations that dominate his life. Should he support the Pope in his conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor, risking war with a powerful neighbor? Should he allow the Church to maintain its independence in matters of law and taxation, or assert royal supremacy at the risk of excommunication? These questions had no easy answers, and the wrong choice could mean eternal damnation for the king's soul or immediate destruction for his kingdom. The threat of excommunication hung over every medieval king like a sword suspended by a thread. A king who defied the church risked being cut off from the sacraments that medieval people believed were necessary for salvation. Worse, excommunication released the king's subjects from their oaths of loyalty, essentially legalizing rebellion and making the king an outlaw in his own kingdom. The spiritual weapons of the church were often more feared than the physical weapons of enemy armies. Religious obligations consumed enormous amounts of the king's time and the kingdom's resources. The king was expected to attend multiple religious services each day, to go on expensive pilgrimages to holy sites, and to fund the construction and maintenance of churches, monasteries, and cathedrals. These religious duties, while spiritually meaningful, also diverted resources and attention from the practical business of governing and defending the kingdom. Let your mind rest for a moment in the quiet contemplation of medieval religious life. Picture the king's private chapel, dimly lit by stained glass windows that cast colored shadows across ancient stone. The silence is broken only by the soft whisper of prayers and the distant sound of bells, marking the passage of the hours. In this sacred space, the king might find a few moments of peace, but even here he could not escape the weight of his crown, or the knowledge that enemies might be plotting his downfall while he knelt in prayer. The economic realities of medieval kingship were as challenging as the political and military aspects. A king's wealth was not measured in bank accounts or investments, but in land, and land produced wealth only through the labor of peasants who might rebel, die of disease, or flee to neighboring territories. The kingdom's economy was perpetually vulnerable to natural disasters, crop failures, and the disruptions caused by constant warfare. Medieval taxation was a crude and inefficient system that often generated more resistance than revenue. Kings had the right to collect various fees and taxes from their subjects, but actually collecting these payments required constant vigilance and the threat of force. Tax collectors were among the most hated people in the kingdom, and they frequently became targets of popular anger when harvests were poor or when royal demands seemed excessive. Imagine the king's frustration as he reviewed the royal accounts by the light of smoky torches. The numbers, recorded on parchment scrolls in the careful script of royal clerks, tell a story of chronic shortage and desperate expedients. The army requires payment, but the royal treasury contains more promises than gold. The castle needs repairs, but the stone quarries are controlled by a rebellious noble. The kingdom's borders must be defended, but the money needed to hire mercenaries could only be raised by taxing subjects who are already on the verge of revolt. The medieval king had access to luxury goods from around the known world, but these treasures came at enormous cost in both money and human lives. Silk from China, spices from India, and precious metals from far-off mines were carried by traders who risked death from bandits, storms, disease, and wild animals. The markup on these goods was enormous, and kings often bankrupted their treasuries to maintain the appearance of wealth and power that their subjects expected. Royal feasts, those legendary celebrations of medieval abundance, were actually carefully choreographed displays of power designed to impress allies and intimidate enemies. The king presided over these events not as a happy host enjoying good food and company, but as a performer playing a role in an elaborate political theater. Every dish served, every guest seated, every toast proposed carried political significance that could determine the fate of kingdoms. The cost of maintaining a royal court suitable to the king's dignity was staggering. Hundreds of servants, guards, and officials required food, clothing, and wages. Horses needed grain and care. Buildings required constant maintenance and repair. The king's wardrobe alone, with its elaborate robes, crowns, and ceremonial weapons, represented a fortune that could have funded a small army for months. Foreign trade, essential for bringing luxury goods and strategic materials to the kingdom, was subject to constant disruption by pirates, wars, and political disputes. A king might negotiate a valuable trade agreement with a distant ruler, only to see the profits disappear when the trade routes were cut by bandits or when political changes brought hostile rulers to power in key territories. Let yourself imagine the weight of these economic pressures. Every decision the king made had financial implications that rippled through the entire kingdom. A war might bring glory and new territory, but it would also drain the treasury and disrupt the agricultural cycle that fed the population. A peace treaty might preserve the kingdom's resources, but it might also be seen as weakness that invited future attacks. The medieval king's health was a matter of constant concern, not just for personal reasons, but because the king's physical condition directly affected the stability of the realm. A king who appeared weak or sick invited challenges from ambitious nobles and foreign enemies. The royal physicians, working with crude instruments and limited knowledge, were as likely to harm as to heal their royal patients. Medieval medicine was a dangerous mixture of folk remedies, religious rituals, and procedures based on ancient theories that bore little resemblance to actual human physiology. Kings were subjected to bloodletting with dirty instruments, purged with toxic substances, and treated with medicines that were often more poisonous than the diseases they were supposed to cure. The king's body was also subject to the stresses of constant warfare, poor diet, and the psychological pressure of ruling. Contemporary accounts describe kings suffering from a wide range of ailments that were probably stress-related: chronic headaches, digestive problems, skin conditions, and premature aging. The famous King's Evil, a form of tuberculosis that was believed to be curable by the royal touch, may actually have been spread by the very ceremonies designed to demonstrate the king's divine healing powers. Picture our king in his private chambers, attended by physicians whose remedies are as likely to kill as to cure. The air is thick with the smoke of burning herbs and the metallic smell of fresh blood from the latest bleeding session. The king's body, scarred by wounds from battle and marked by the stress of constant vigilance, bears witness to the terrible cost of medieval kingship. Yet he must maintain the appearance of strength and health, for any sign of weakness could trigger a succession crisis or encourage rebellion. Sleep, that refuge from the cares of the day that we all cherish, was often denied to medieval kings. The royal bedchamber, despite its elaborate furnishings and supposed security, was actually one of the most dangerous places in the castle. Many kings died in their beds, not from natural causes but from poison, smothering, or blades wielded by assassins who had gained access through bribery or conspiracy. The king's bed itself was a massive construction of carved wood and heavy textiles, designed more for display than for comfort. The mattresses, stuffed with straw or feathers, provided little support and were frequently infested with fleas, lice, and other parasites. The heavy curtains that surrounded the bed, intended to provide privacy and warmth, also trapped stale air and blocked the light that might reveal approaching danger. Even when physical threats were absent, the king's sleep was disturbed by the weight of his responsibilities and the constant need to be alert to changing circumstances. Messengers might arrive at any hour with news of invasions, rebellions, or disasters that required immediate royal attention. The king who slept too soundly might wake to find his kingdom in ruins or his throne occupied by a rival claimant. Dreams, when they came, were often nightmares filled with images of defeat, betrayal, and death. Medieval people believed that dreams were messages from God or visitations from supernatural forces, so even the king's sleep became another arena where political and spiritual concerns intruded on personal peace. A king who reported disturbing dreams might find his advisors interpreting them as omens of disaster or signs of divine displeasure. Let your own breathing slow and deepen as you imagine the medieval king lying sleepless in his great bed. Outside the narrow windows, the wind howls through the castle's towers and battlements, carrying with it the sounds of a world that never truly sleeps. Somewhere in the darkness, enemies might be gathering, allies might be plotting betrayal, and the future of the kingdom might be decided by forces beyond the king's control. The seasonal cycle, which brought beauty and renewal to the common people, was for medieval kings another source of anxiety and danger. Spring brought the beginning of the campaign season, when roads became passable for armies and kings prepared for war. Summer meant long months away from the relative safety of the castle, leading armies through hostile territory or defending borders against invasion. Autumn, despite its harvest abundance, was often the most dangerous time for medieval kings. It was the season when armies, fattened by the summer's campaigns and enriched by plunder, might be most tempted to turn against their own leaders. The harvest season also brought its own challenges, as kings struggled to collect taxes from subjects who might have little left after paying for their own survival through the coming winter. Winter, rather than being a time of rest and celebration, was often a season of siege and suffering. Enemies who could not be defeated in open battle might surround a king's castle and wait for starvation and disease to accomplish what weapons could not. The king, trapped within his own walls, could only watch as his supplies dwindled and his followers began to consider surrender or betrayal. The medieval calendar was marked not by holidays and vacations, but by religious observances that carried political significance and military campaigns that determined the fate of kingdoms. Christmas was not a time of family joy, but a crucial period when kings needed to demonstrate their piety and generosity to maintain the loyalty of their subjects. Easter brought not renewal, but the beginning of another year of struggle and uncertainty. Imagine our king standing at the narrow window of his castle, looking out over the landscape that was both his kingdom and his prison. In spring, he sees the green fields that must be defended from invasion. In summer, he sees the roads that enemy armies might travel to reach his gates. In autumn, he sees the harvest that might be his last if the coming winter brings siege or rebellion. In winter, he sees the snow that might hide the approach of enemies, or the graves of subjects who died because of his failures as a ruler. The very concept of privacy, which we consider a basic human right, was almost unknown to medieval kings. Every moment of the royal day was observed, recorded, and analyzed by courtiers, servants, and visitors who might later report their observations to allies or enemies. The king's health, his relationships with family members, his religious practices, and his personal habits were all subjects of intense scrutiny and political speculation. Royal correspondence, carried by messengers who might be intercepted or bribed, was never truly private. Letters between kings and their allies could fall into enemy hands, revealing strategic plans or diplomatic secrets that could destroy carefully negotiated alliances. Even the king's most intimate thoughts, if committed to writing, might someday be used as evidence against him in political or religious courts. The king's personal relationships were inevitably contaminated by political considerations. A friendship with a particular noble might be interpreted as favoritism that angered other court factions. A romantic relationship, even within marriage, could create diplomatic complications if the lady in question had foreign connections or competing loyalties. The king's children, rather than being sources of joy and pride, were often pawns in political games that began before their birth and continued long after their deaths. Picture the loneliness of a man who could never speak freely, never trust completely, never love without considering the political implications of his affection. The medieval king was surrounded by people but isolated by his position, wealthy in material goods, but impoverished in genuine human connection, powerful in authority, but powerless to escape the prison of his own crown. The technology of medieval warfare, primitive by our standards, was nevertheless terrifyingly effective at causing death and suffering. The king, as both a target and a symbol, was constantly exposed to weapons designed specifically to kill him. Crossbow bolts could penetrate the finest armor at close range. Poisoned arrows could cause lingering, agonizing death, even from minor wounds. Siege engines could hurl massive stones or pots of burning oil that could crush or incinerate anyone in their path. The medieval battlefield was chaos incarnate, a place where the fog of war was literal as well as metaphorical. Smoke from burning buildings, dust kicked up by thousands of horses and men, and the general confusion of combat made it almost impossible for a king to maintain command and control over his forces. Many battles were decided not by superior strategy, but by chance encounters, communication failures, or the simple exhaustion of men fighting in heavy armor under the blazing sun. The king's armor, while providing some protection, was also a potential death trap. If a king fell from his horse while wearing full armor, he might be unable to rise without assistance, making him an easy target for enemy soldiers. The weight and bulk of medieval armor also made it difficult to move quickly or to see clearly, handicaps that could prove fatal in the fluid dynamics of combat. The aftermath of medieval battles was a horror that haunts the historical record. Wounded kings, if they survived the initial combat, faced the prospect of primitive medical treatment that was often worse than no treatment at all. Infections from dirty weapons or crude surgical procedures killed more medieval warriors than direct combat wounds. The king who survived a battle might die weeks later from complications that modern medicine could easily prevent or cure. Let your mind wander across these ancient battlefields. Feel the weight of armor on your shoulders, the restriction of vision through a narrow helmet visor, the difficulty of breathing in the confined space of a metal helm. Hear the clash of weapons, the screams of wounded men and horses, the shouted orders that are barely audible above the din of combat. Smell the acrid smoke, the metallic scent of blood, the sweat and fear of thousands of men facing death together. The diplomatic life of a medieval king was a constant chess game, played with human lives as pieces and kingdoms as prizes. Every alliance carried the risk of entanglement in foreign wars. Every treaty contained clauses that might someday be used to justify invasion or rebellion. Every diplomatic marriage created new obligations and new opportunities for foreign interference in domestic affairs. Medieval diplomacy was conducted without the benefit of modern communications, international law, or neutral mediators. Ambassadors traveled for weeks or months to reach foreign courts, carrying messages that might be obsolete by the time they arrived. Treaties were written in languages that most participants could not read, relying on translators who might have their own political agendas. The lack of standardized weights, measures, and currencies made even simple commercial agreements complicated and subject to misunderstanding. The medieval king's ambassadors were as much spies as diplomats, gathering intelligence about foreign military capabilities, political stability, and economic resources. They were also potential hostages, subject to imprisonment or execution if diplomatic relations soured. The king who sent an embassy to a foreign court might never see his representatives again, and their fate often reflected the success or failure of his diplomatic initiatives. Picture our king in his council chamber, surrounded by maps and documents that represent the complex web of medieval international relations. Each piece of parchment represents a potential alliance or a possible threat. Each sealed letter might contain an offer of friendship or a declaration of war. The king must navigate this maze of competing interests and hidden agendas while maintaining the appearance of confidence and control. The royal court was theoretically the center of medieval civilization, a place where learning, art, and culture flourished under royal patronage. In reality, the court was often a place of ignorance, superstition, and barbarism that would shock modern sensibilities. The majority of courtiers, including many of the king's closest advisors, were illiterate. Important decisions were made based on astrological calculations, religious omens, or simple prejudice rather than rational analysis. Medieval entertainment, even at the royal level, was often crude and violent by modern standards. Tournaments, while romanticized in later literature, were actually brutal competitions where death and serious injury were common occurrences. The king was expected to participate in these events, risking his life for the entertainment of his subjects and the maintenance of his martial reputation. The royal library, if it existed at all, contained perhaps a few dozen books, most of them religious texts copied by hand and decorated with elaborate illuminations. The cost of a single book was equivalent to the annual income of a prosperous merchant, making knowledge literally more precious than gold. The king himself might be barely literate, able to sign his name and perhaps read simple documents, but dependent on clerks and scribes for most written communication. The intellectual isolation of medieval kingship was as confining as the physical walls of the castle. New ideas traveled slowly, if at all, across the fragmented landscape of medieval Europe. A scientific discovery made in one kingdom might take decades to reach neighboring realms, and by then it might be distorted beyond recognition by repeated retelling. The king, who wanted to learn about the world beyond his borders, had to rely on the accounts of travelers, merchants, and pilgrims, whose stories were often colored by superstition, exaggeration, or deliberate deception. Let yourself imagine the frustration of ruling a kingdom while knowing so little about the wider world. Picture our king studying crude maps that showed vast blank areas marked only with warnings about dragons or sea monsters. The edges of the known world were literally the edges of possibility, beyond which lay mysteries that might contain salvation or destruction for the kingdom. The royal household was a complex organism with hundreds of servants, officials, and hangers-on, all dependent on the king's favor for their survival and advancement. This created an atmosphere of constant competition and intrigue that made the court as dangerous as any battlefield. The king had to navigate between competing factions while maintaining the loyalty of people whose primary concern was their own advancement rather than the welfare of the realm. The king's personal servants, those closest to his daily life, were often the most dangerous people in the castle. The royal barber, who shaved the king's face with a razor-sharp blade each morning, could easily cut the royal throat instead. The king's food tasters and wine-bearers had countless opportunities to administer poison. Even the servants who dressed the king and helped him with his armor could conceal weapons or leave strategic vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The complexity of medieval court etiquette was itself a form of imprisonment. Every gesture, every word, every piece of clothing carried symbolic meaning that could have political implications. The king who wore the wrong color to a ceremony might inadvertently insult a foreign ambassador. The king who failed to observe proper precedents in seating arrangements might create enemies among his own nobles. The weight of ceremony was as heavy as the crown itself, restricting the king's freedom of movement and expression. Breathe slowly as you consider the exhaustion of performing constantly, of never being able to simply be human without considering the political ramifications of every action. The medieval king lived his entire life as a symbol rather than a person, sacrificing his individual humanity for the supposed good of his kingdom. The question of royal legitimacy haunted every medieval throne. Unlike modern democracies, where leaders derive their authority from popular elections, medieval kings claimed to rule by divine right, their authority supposedly granted directly by God. But this divine sanction had to be constantly demonstrated and reaffirmed through military success, economic prosperity, and religious devotion. A king who suffered defeats, whose realm was plagued by famine or disease, or who fell out of favor with the church, might find his divine mandate questioned by subjects and rivals alike. The medieval world was filled with competing claimants to every throne, ambitious nobles who could trace their bloodlines back to previous rulers, foreign princes with hereditary claims, and bastard sons whose illegitimate birth might be overlooked if they proved successful in battle. The king's hold on power was never secure, never guaranteed, never safe from challenge by someone who claimed a better right to rule. Religious controversy added another layer of complexity to questions of royal legitimacy. A king who was excommunicated by the Pope lost not only his spiritual standing, but also his political authority, as subjects were released from their oaths of loyalty to a ruler condemned by the Church. The threat of excommunication was a powerful weapon that religious leaders could use to control secular rulers, creating a constant tension between royal and ecclesiastical authority. Picture our king kneeling in his private chapel, praying not just for guidance and protection, but for some sign that God still favored his reign. The flickering candlelight casts dancing shadows on the stone walls, and the king searches those shadows for omens of divine approval or condemnation. Every military defeat, every natural disaster, every outbreak of disease in his realm might be interpreted as evidence that God had withdrawn his favor from the royal house. The burden of medieval kingship extended beyond the king himself to his entire family. Royal wives lived under constant scrutiny, their every pregnancy monitored for signs of the male heir that would secure the succession. Their foreign birth often made them suspect in the eyes of their subjects, seen as potential agents of enemy powers rather than loyal members of the royal house. The pressure to produce sons could destroy royal marriages and create lasting animosity between kings and queens, who should have been partners in the difficult task of ruling. Royal children, rather than enjoying the carefree innocence we associate with childhood, were political assets from the moment of their birth. Their educations were designed not to nurture individual talents, but to prepare them for lives of service to the state. Young princes learned that their personal desires and preferences were secondary to the needs of the realm, while princesses understood that their marriages would be arranged to secure political alliances rather than personal happiness. The medieval king's relationship with his subjects was fundamentally different from the relationship between modern leaders and citizens. Medieval people were subjects, not citizens, bound to their king by personal oaths of loyalty rather than abstract concepts of citizenship or democratic participation. This personal bond could be a source of strength when subjects genuinely loved and respected their king, but it could also be fragile when the king failed to meet the expectations of personal leadership and protection. The king was expected to be personally accessible to his subjects, to hear their complaints and petitions, to dispense justice with his own hands, rather than delegating these responsibilities to bureaucrats or judges. This meant that the king's day was filled with an endless procession of people seeking royal favor, each bringing their own problems and expectations. The weight of individual human suffering pressed upon the crown like a physical burden, as the king heard stories of injustice, poverty, disease, and despair that he was expected to remedy through royal intervention. Let your imagination drift through the throne room where these petitions were heard. Stone walls echo with the voices of farmers whose crops have failed, merchants whose goods have been stolen by bandits, widows whose husbands died in royal service, and countless others whose survival depends on royal mercy. The king, sitting on his hard throne with the heavy crown pressing down upon his head, must somehow find solutions to problems that have no easy answers, must somehow ease suffering that is beyond any single person's power to heal. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created their own cycles of royal anxiety and responsibility. Spring brought not renewal and hope, but the beginning of another campaign season, another year of potential warfare and destruction. The king had to prepare for military action, while praying that diplomacy might prevent the need for bloodshed. Summer meant long months away from the relative safety of the royal castle. leading armies through hostile territory, where death might come from enemy weapons, disease, accident, or treachery from within his own ranks. Autumn, despite bringing the harvest that sustained the realm through winter, was often the most dangerous season for medieval kings. It was during the harvest season that taxes were collected, creating resentment among subjects who saw their hard-won grain disappearing into royal coffers. It was also the season when armies, enriched by summer campaigns and restless from months of warfare, might be most tempted to turn against their own commanders. The king who had led his men to victory might find himself facing rebellion from soldiers who decided they deserved a larger share of the spoils. Winter, rather than offering rest and celebration, often brought siege and starvation. Enemies who could not defeat the king in open battle might surround his strongholds and wait for hunger and cold to accomplish what weapons could not. The king, trapped within his own walls, could only watch his supplies dwindle and his followers grow desperate. The approach of winter was not a promise of cozy evenings by the fire, but a reminder that survival itself was never guaranteed. The medieval king's understanding of his own realm was severely limited by the primitive state of transportation and communication. A kingdom that could be crossed by modern highway in a few hours might take weeks to traverse on medieval roads, if roads existed at all. Many regions were accessible only by footpaths through forests, mountain passes that were impassable for much of the year, or river routes that depended on seasonal water levels and weather conditions. This meant that the king's knowledge of conditions in distant parts of his realm was always outdated and often inaccurate. A rebellion might rage for weeks before word reached the royal court. A harvest failure in one region might cause starvation, while neighboring areas enjoyed abundance. But the king might not learn of the crisis until it was too late to organize effective relief efforts. The kingdom existed more as a theoretical concept than as a practical reality that could be governed through direct royal intervention. The king's representatives in distant regions, governors, sheriffs, and other royal officials, operated with a degree of independence that was both necessary and dangerous. These men had to make decisions and take actions in the king's name without the possibility of consulting their royal master about changing circumstances. They might be loyal servants of the crown, or they might be ambitious opportunists who used their positions to build personal power bases that could eventually challenge royal authority. Picture our king studying reports from his distant territories, each document telling a different story of the realm's condition. One report describes peace and prosperity, while another warns of approaching enemies. One official requests additional troops to maintain order, while another complains that royal soldiers are disrupting local commerce. The king must somehow synthesize this contradictory information into a coherent understanding of his kingdom's true condition, knowing that the reality on the ground might be completely different from what his reports suggest. The economic foundation of medieval kingship was both simpler and more precarious than modern government finance. The king's wealth depended primarily on agricultural production from royal lands, and agriculture in the medieval period was subject to countless variables beyond human control. A late frost could destroy fruit crops. Too much rain could rot grain in the fields. Drought could cause widespread famine. Plant diseases, insect swarms, and animal plagues could devastate the agricultural economy that supported the entire royal apparatus. The king had limited ability to respond to economic crises. There were no central banks to provide emergency funding, no international aid organizations to provide relief supplies, no sophisticated financial instruments that could spread risk across multiple markets. When disaster struck, the king's resources were whatever he had managed to accumulate in good years, and these reserves were often inadequate to address major emergencies. The constant need for ready cash to fund armies, maintain fortifications, and respond to crises led many medieval kings to desperate expedients that ultimately weakened their positions. Royal lands might be sold to raise quick money, reducing the king's long-term income. Taxes might be raised to punitive levels, creating resentment and resistance among subjects. The king might debase the currency by reducing the precious metal content of coins, causing inflation that hurt everyone in the kingdom. The temptation to solve financial problems through warfare and plunder was enormous, but war itself was expensive and uncertain. A successful campaign might bring enough loot to solve the kingdom's financial problems, but an unsuccessful war could bankrupt the realm and leave it vulnerable to invasion by enemies who had avoided the costs of military adventure. Let yourself feel the weight of these impossible choices. Imagine our king in his private chamber, surrounded by account books and tax rolls that tell the story of a kingdom always on the edge of financial disaster. Every decision carries enormous risks, and the margin for error is so small that a single mistake could bring down not just the king, but the entire social and economic structure that depends on royal leadership. The medieval king's personal health was both a private concern and a matter of vital public interest. The king's physical condition directly affected the stability of the realm, as enemies and rivals watched for any sign of weakness that might provide an opportunity for challenge or invasion. A king who appeared sick or disabled invited aggression from neighbors who might otherwise respect his power. Medieval medicine, despite the dedication of royal physicians, was more likely to harm than help royal patients. The theory of humoral balance that dominated medieval medical thinking led to treatments designed to restore equilibrium between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile through bloodletting, purging, and the administration of substances that were often toxic. The king who submitted to medical treatment might be weakened by the cure more than by the original disease. The king's diet, despite access to the finest foods available in his realm, was often nutritionally inadequate and sometimes dangerous. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries, leading to vitamin deficiencies that caused scurvy, night blindness, and other ailments. The heavy emphasis on meat and grain provided calories but lacked the micronutrients necessary for optimal health. The spices that flavored royal meals, while adding variety to the diet, were often used to mask the taste of spoiled food rather than to enhance fresh ingredients. The stress of royal life took its own toll on the king's body. Contemporary accounts describe kings suffering from chronic headaches, digestive problems, skin conditions, and premature aging. The constant vigilance required to survive in the treacherous world of medieval politics prevented the deep, restorative sleep that is essential for physical and mental health. The king's body became a battlefield where the stresses of rulership fought against the basic biological needs for rest, nutrition, and peace. The royal physician, despite his elevated status and access to the finest medical knowledge of his time, was often as much a political figure as a medical practitioner. His diagnoses and treatments could have enormous political implications, as rival factions might interpret the king's health problems as signs of divine displeasure or evidence of fitness to rule. The physician who successfully treated the king gained enormous influence and rewards, while the one who failed might face exile or execution. Breathe slowly and deeply as you imagine the medieval king lying in his great bed, attended by physicians whose remedies seem as likely to kill as to cure. The air is thick with the smoke of burning herbs and the metallic smell of blood from the latest bleeding session. The king's body, scarred by wounds from countless battles and marked by the stress of constant vigilance, bears witness to the terrible cost of medieval rulership. The approach of death for a medieval king was not a private transition, but a public crisis that could determine the fate of the entire realm. The king's deathbed became the center of political maneuvering as various factions positioned themselves for the succession struggle that would follow, Family members, court officials, and powerful nobles gathered around the dying king, each pressing their own interests while maintaining the appearance of loyal concern. The king's final words and actions carried enormous weight, as they might be interpreted as binding instructions for the future governance of the realm. The choice of successor, if the king had multiple potential heirs, could trigger civil wars that might last for generations. The distribution of royal treasure and lands among followers could determine the balance of power in the post-succession period. The medieval understanding of death as a spiritual transition, rather than merely a biological event, added another layer of complexity to the royal deathbed. The king was expected to demonstrate proper Christian resignation and faith, to forgive his enemies, and to provide for the spiritual welfare of his soul through appropriate religious observances. The manner of the king's death was seen as a reflection of his character and a predictor of his eternal fate. Picture our king in his final moments, surrounded by the stone walls that have been both his fortress and his prison. The flickering light of candles illuminates the faces of those who wait to see how his story will end. Some are genuinely grieved by his approaching death, while others calculate how his passing might advance their own fortunes. The crown, that has been the source of both his power and his suffering, waits nearby, ready to pass to whoever can claim it and hold it against all challengers. As we near the end of our gentle journey through the harsh realities of medieval kingship, let your breathing become even slower and deeper. Allow yourself to feel gratitude for the simple freedoms you enjoy. The freedom to speak without fear of political consequences, to eat food that is safe and nutritious, to sleep peacefully without guards at your door, to love without considering the diplomatic implications of your affections. The medieval king, for all his power and privilege, lived a life of constant danger, crushing responsibility and profound isolation. The crown that symbolized his authority was also the heaviest burden any human being could bear. The throne that elevated him above his subjects also separated him from the simple human connections that make life meaningful and joyful. Yet these kings persevered, day after day, year after year, carrying the weight of their crowns and the hopes of their people through times of war and peace, abundance and famine, triumph and defeat. They sacrificed their personal happiness and often their lives for the abstract concept of royal duty, maintaining the fragile structures of civilization through sheer force of will and determination. In our comfortable modern world, we sometimes romanticize the medieval period, imagining it as a time of chivalry and honor, of brave knights and beautiful princesses. But the reality was far harsher, far more dangerous, and far more demanding than our romantic fantasies suggest. The medieval king lived at the center of this harsh reality, bearing responsibilities that would crush most modern leaders and facing dangers that would terrify the bravest among us. As you drift toward sleep, carry with you an appreciation for the sacrifices made by these long-dead rulers who shaped the world we inherited. Their struggles, their failures, and their occasional triumphs laid the foundations for the freedoms and securities we enjoy today. The medieval king's crown was heavy indeed, but it was that weight that slowly, over centuries, forged the lighter burdens of modern leadership. Let yourself rest now in the knowledge that the battles they fought, the prices they paid, and the burdens they carried have given us a world where kingship is no longer a death sentence, where leadership is a service rather than a sacrifice, and where the crown, if it exists at all, is more symbol than burden. Sleep peacefully, safe in your warm bed, protected by laws and institutions that medieval kings could barely imagine, free from the constant fear that shadowed every medieval throne. The weight of the medieval crown has been lifted from human shoulders, replaced by lighter burdens shared among many rather than concentrated on one. The king's long vigil is over, and we can rest in the security their sacrifices have purchased for us. sweet dreams.